Hello and welcome to the first installment of my Worst to Best series. For the inaugural episode of this series, I thought what better band to talk about than one of my favorite bands of all time, Genesis. I will be ranking their 15 studio albums from worst to best. Of course, this is completely subjective and all my personal opinion. I'm not saying the first album I mention is the absolute worst album ever and the top album I'm mentioning is the absolute best. I'm just saying this is simply my own ranking of this band's impressive discography. I'm also not reviewing each album that I will be talking about, but rather explaining why it is placed where it is in my ranking. I will rate each album a certain amount out of 10 when I'm done discussing them. So with that being said, let's dive right in. Phil Collins' absence is felt on Calling All Stations, and it's for that reason that I think this album suffers. Phil Collins wasn't just a great drummer and singer, but he was also an arranger. So quite honestly, I don't like a single song on this album, which I can't say for any other Genesis album. That's not to say there aren't good moments here and there, but they're just incredibly scarce. The Dividing Line and One Man's Fool are the only songs on this record I can tolerate. The rest isn't worth checking out unless you're a completionist. I will give this album a 3 out of 10. Invisible Touch captured Genesis at their commercial peak. The garish 80s production and poor songwriting makes this one of my least favorite albums from the band. However, I thoroughly enjoy listening to tracks such as Land of Confusion, Throwing It All Away, and The Brazilian, which is probably the most proggy thing on the album. I find this album to be better than Calling All Stations, but not by much. The band try and throw a bone to the older prog fans with the 10-minute track Domino, but other than the chorus, it doesn't do much for me. I will give this album a 4 out of 10. You Can't Dance was released in the 90s when CDs were the most popular audio format, and because of that, the band tried filling the CD to its maximum duration. As a result, there are numerous superfluous tracks which should have been left off of this album, as We Can't Dance is 70 plus minutes long. If it wasn't for the final track, Fading Lights, I would probably rank this album lower, but that song is so good, it doesn't even deserve to be on a mediocre album such as this. I will give this album a 4 out of 10. Abacab was the first real letdown from Genesis, in my opinion. The band went in a completely different musical direction, and I think at times it works, but for the most part, this album is really weak. I enjoy the first side a lot, but the second side is where the album falters for me. Who Done It is not good, but it's not their worst song by far, despite what others may say, mainly because the band's intention was to make it sound bad, I think. The last 2 songs on the album are incredibly forgettable. The rest of the album is decent. My favorite song is Keep It Dark, and I will rate Abacab a 5 out of 10. Genesis's debut album was not at all indicative of the musical direction the band would go in on subsequent albums. The production is poor, and the music is very of its time, and it sounds like ordinary 60s pop rock. Peter Gabriel's vocals add life to some of the songs, but even then, the music isn't particularly interesting and engrossing. The only song I can say I like is In the Wilderness because of the chorus and the haunting chord progression and piano melody at the end of the song. So I will rate this album a 5 out of 10. The self-titled Genesis album is by far their most inconsistent album, but when it hits hard. The first side of the album is perfect, but the second side is a bit uneven. I like some songs such as Taking It All Too Hard and Just a Job to Do. The rest of the songs on the album, on the second disc, are half-baked and contain some of the weakest material from the band, in my opinion. Illegal Alien has always been one of my least favorite Genesis songs. I just find it to be musically egregious and lyrically tasteless. My favorite songs are Mama, Home by the Sea, and Second Home by the Sea. So I will rate this album a 5 out of 10. For me, Duke is the best 80s Genesis album. It is the perfect balance between prog and pop, both of which Genesis seem to excel at. There are times where this album feels a bit inconsistent and more like a Phil Collins solo album than a Genesis album, but I still really enjoy the music that is found on this record. Also, I think that some of Phil Collins' best vocals are captured on this album, as he was confident in himself as a frontman, but not too much to the point where he was practically screaming on every song like on some of the later albums. The difference between this album and the previous one I talked about in my ranking is quite large in terms of the quality of music. My favorite songs are Duchess and Duke's Travels, and I will rate this album an 8 out of 10. Steve Hackett's absence is felt on And Then There Were Three, but I still find this album to be a bit more consistent than Duke, which is why I ranked it higher. Other than Scenes from a Night's Dream, which I don't care for much at all, this album is near flawless. Like Duke, there are elements of pop and prog on this album, and the fusion of the two makes it for a really interesting, yet cohesive album. My favorite tracks are the last two, The Lady Lies and Follow You, Follow Me, and I will rate this album an 8 out of 10. Trespass was the album where Genesis found their sound, but they still had yet to polish and perfect it. Many of these songs meander through the musical landscape, and some, like Looking for Someone, don't really go anywhere, but are still nevertheless interesting. And overall, this strongly indicates the musical direction the band would go in on future albums. The Knife is probably the heaviest Genesis song, and is one of my favorites on the album. I also love White Mountain, which is haunting, and Visions of Angels, which is gorgeous. I will rate this album an 8 out of 10. A Trick of the Tail is the first album with Phil Collins as the lead singer and without Peter Gabriel singing. The only tracks I don't care for are Robbery, Assault and Battery, and the title track. The former has an appalling chorus, but the interesting time signature changes during the instrumental section makes up for it, and the title track is a bit throwaway for me. The rest of the album is stunning. My favorite tracks are Entangled and Ripples, and I will give this album a 9 out of 10. The Lamb Lies Down on Broadway is a double concept album. I'm of the opinion that this album would have probably made a better single album, but it begs the question of what would you remove from the album? I'm not sure, to be honest. The second side of the first album is near perfect and contains some of the best music Genesis has ever recorded and written. The second album as a totality is a bit disjointed and feels rushed at times, but is still really enjoyable. This album has a good mixture of short interludes, average-length songs, and some longer prog songs, all of which vary in sound and style. The Lamb Lies Down on Broadway is an album that, to this day, surprises me with bits that I haven't heard or noticed before, and it's for that reason that I will give this album a 9 out of 10. In my opinion, the album that followed A Trick of the Tail, which is Wind and Wuthering, is actually, in my opinion, better than its predecessor. This is a perfect winter album, as captured not only by the album cover, but also the romantic, yearning quality of the music. The second side of the album is near perfect if it wasn't for All in a Mouse's Night, which should have been replaced with Inside and Out, which would have made this album a 10 out of 10 for me, but whatever. My favorite songs are Blood on the Rooftops and the final 3 tracks, which bleed into each other as one song, Unquiet Slumbers for the Sleepers, In That Quiet Earth, and the tearjerker closer that is Afterglow. And it's for that reason that I'm giving this album a 9 out of 10. Nursery Cryme is the first Genesis album to feature the classic 5-piece lineup with Phil Collins, Peter Gabriel, Mike Rutherford, Tony Banks, and Steve Hackett. This album is also, in my opinion, the band's first masterpiece. I love every song, and my favorites are The Musical Box and The Fountain of Salmacis. I am giving this album a 10 out of 10. The band's last masterpiece, in my opinion, is Solid England by The Pound. Sure, it's not perfect, as it contains More Fool Me, and even After the Ordeal, to an extent, I'm not the biggest fan of, but the rest of the album is so great that it overshadows both of those songs. I think that while Nursery Cryme is technically a better album, I have such a strong connection to Solid England by The Pound that sentimentality kind of makes me want to rate it higher. And the musicianship on the album is better than ever, and I think that this is one of the best produced Genesis albums. Each bombastic track has a foil track, which creates an impeccable album flow. My favorite songs are Dancing with the Moonlit Night, Firth of Fifth, and The Cinema Show, and I will rate this album a 10 out of 10. As a complete album, Foxtrot is the strongest Genesis album and the closest the band has come, in my opinion, to perfection. From the haunting mellotron chords that start Watcher of the Skies to the ethereal concluding section of Supper's Ready, which is As Sure as Eggs is Eggs, this album perfectly captures what 70s progressive rock is about. I love this album dearly, and I don't think music gets much better than this. To put it simply, this album makes life better. My favorite song is the epic Supper's Ready, and how can I not give this album a 10 out of 10? It is absolutely a masterpiece. Thank you all for watching. Please feel free to share your ranking of the Genesis discography in the comments below. And definitely subscribe to my YouTube channel to get notified of new content that I will definitely upload in the future. And hopefully I'll see you guys in another video.